Okay, everybody, welcome back to part 3 of Module 65. This will be the last part of Mod 65. We're going to get this done. All right, so our question here is how can economy get itself out of a recessionary or an inflationary gap? And this is called classical economics. This idea that the economy will fix itself without government intervention. Now, we did talk that, these days the government is a lot more likely to get involved in the economy, especially if it's in a recessionary gap. How can it help, how can it help get it out of it? But this classical point of view is that the economy will fix itself. And, that point of view, it is still around, and there are still arguments about like how much the government should or should not get involved, and does the government involvement just sort of make it worse, or if the government would just stay out of it, would it get better on its own? So now we're going to talk about this idea of the self-regulating economy, the economy that fixes itself. And then in the next module, we are going then to talk about, well, if the economy does not fix itself, what can the government do to get in there and help it out? All right, so here first we're going to talk about a recessionary gap and fixing itself out of a recessionary gap. So the first thing we need to do is we need to draw an economy in a recessionary gap. So we know the drill: price level, real GDP, short run aggregate supply curve, aggregate demand curve, and then the dot that shows where the economy is. Now, recessionary gap, that means that the economy is producing this level of output, but we want it to be producing more, so the long run aggregate supply curve is to the right of that short run equilibrium point. Okay, so let's say that the economy is here. It's in this recessionary gap, which means that unemployment is high, right? Employment is low, and real GDP, the output is low, and unemployment is high. A lot of people are out of work. All right, so let's go through these steps. It says step 1, there's a negative demand shock that puts the economy into a recession. So the idea is that, like, before this happened, the economy was here in this long run equilibrium, and then boom, there was this negative demand shock that put it into a recessionary gap. All right, which meant that aggregate demand went down. So, we can actually, let's draw that in. So the idea is that the economy, it started here at this long run equilibrium, and then it went here to this recessionary gap. All right, so we're in this recessionary gap. Wages fall because of that high unemployment rate. Well, remember that story I told about my mom's secretary and how they're in an inflationary gap? She had to raise wages to get employees. Well, in a recessionary gap, when companies, they can actually lower people's wages. It happened to my sister once. We were in this terrible recession, that great recession of 2008, and her bosses said, "Hey guys, guess what? We don't have any money right now. We can't pay you all what we used to. We don't have the business. So we're going to lower everyone's wages by 5%. And in that situation, like, what options did my sister have, right? Like, the economy was crap, unemployment was really high, it was really hard to find jobs, and her bosses lowered her wages by 5%. So she had two options. Option 1 was to say, forget you guys, I'm out of here to go find another job. And option 2 was to accept it. And that's that. Well, she chose option 2 to accept it because option 1, which was to go find another job, was not a really good option because there were no other jobs. And then also, if we think back to my mom trying to hire somebody, well, if the economy is really bad and there's tons of people looking for work, and she puts out that ad saying that she's going to pay $15 an hour for a secretary who can answer the phones, use a computer, and type, Well, she'll get tons of applications because there's so many people out of work. They'll be like, yes, me, hire me. I'll take it, right? Even if they're qualified to get a better job, there are no better jobs, so they'll take it. So, which means that she'll be like, well, I'll pay people $12 an hour and I'll still get somebody awesome to do this job. So, for why here, we can put when everyone or when lots of people need a job, they'll work for less money. Okay, so economy goes into a recessionary gap. Wages start to fall. Number 3, because wages fell, companies can make more money. What? So they're paying their people less, and now their profits can start to go up, so there we go, profits go up. Well, higher profits lead to companies producing more, which is a fancy way of saying that short run aggregate supply goes up. Well, if the short run aggregate supply goes up, let's draw that in on our graph. So short run aggregate supply going up, that's a rightward shift. Look at that. Short run aggregate supply 2. And now we're back at long run equilibrium. So we started here, and then we went to here when the aggregate demand dropped. And then we went to here when the short run aggregate supply increased after wages went down. And so the economy is back at long run equilibrium. Now, what are the consequences though? We started at 1, we ended up at 3. Well, real GDP, it went down for a little bit and then it came back, but the price level dropped. So we can add that down here. Price level went down as well. So, oh wait, actually we have that right here. Result of a negative demand shock equals, the price level will go down. And we're going to add in parentheses, if the economy fixes itself. Because as we're going to see in the next module, that if the economy doesn't fix itself and if the government jumps in to try to fix it, the graph isn't going to look like this. It's going to be a different sequence. So this is the graph that tells us the story of what happens if there is a negative demand shock or a decrease in aggregate demand, and if the economy fixes itself. This is the story of that. Okay, page 7. Well, what would happen if the economy was in an inflationary gap and the economy fixed itself? So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to draw an economy in an inflationary gap. So we have price level, we have real GDP, we have, actually, let's do it a little differently. Let's draw that economy in long run equilibrium. And we're saying that the economy starts at that because step 1 is a positive demand shock, puts economy into an inflationary gap. So then let's draw that in. So there's this positive demand shock, meaning that more people will run out and buy more stuff. And that puts the economy into point 2, that inflationary gap. That meant that the aggregate demand went up. Okay. So some of you might want to, be drawing some arrows to that. Make your notes so that you understand them. All right, so then here it says wages rise because of the low unemployment rate, right? Because if we're there, that means that the output is like super high and unemployment is super low. So we have that low unemployment rate at 0.2 there. And why? Because companies, so it says wages rise because of low unemployment rate. Why? Companies have to pay workers more. to keep them. Workers more to keep them. And we talked about that already, about why they have to do that. So because wages rose, companies can't make as much money, which means that the profits go down. And then lower profits lead to companies producing less, and that's called a decrease in short-run aggregate supply. So let's draw that in. What does that decrease in short-run aggregate supply look like? It's a leftward shift in short-run aggregate supply, which will bring us back to long-run equilibrium here at 0.3. And so that gets a happy face. And as we can see from our graph, we started at 0.1, we ended at 0.3. So the result of a positive demand shock is that the price level increased. Okay, but notice people's wages increased too, so it's all good. All right. So this is that story. If the economy gets a positive demand shock, ends up in an inflationary gap, how will it fix itself? Well, it will fix itself because the wages will increase. The short-run aggregate supply curve will decrease. It will be back at long-run equilibrium, but the result will be that inflation happened. The price level increased. Maybe we should add that term inflation to remind ourselves that inflation means price level increases. One more page. Okay, so here we go. Your book wanted to introduce you to this in this module. So macroeconomic policy. All right, so policy, that is kind of a way of saying the decisions made by the government decisions. So macroeconomic policy means what can the government do to help get the economy out of a gap? And then, well, we just talked about for 2 pages of notes that what the economy can do to fix itself, right? By wages will go up or down, short-run aggregate supply curve will go left or right, abracadabra, it's back at long-run equilibrium. But, well, so then why do we need macroeconomic policy? Why is it necessary for the government to help the economy if it is self-regulating? Because that self-regulation can take really long. Like it can take like 10 years. It can take longer than that. And it is really hard to have an economy sit, especially in a recessionary gap for 10 years. Because what does that mean? It means that people are out of work. It means that people are not okay. So the government wants to step in and help speed that process along. And they do that with what they call stabilization policies, where the government tries to smooth out the business cycle. And they do that for price stability so that they can avoid, so no high inflation, avoiding that high inflation. And remember, the inflationary gap can cause that high inflation. And then they want to reduce unemployment during the recessionary gaps. And we will talk about what that looks like in our next module. All right, don't forget about your summary. Don't forget to read the textbook. Don't forget to do your practice problems. And don't forget to come to the Google Meet where we can learn, or really get to understand this stuff even better. All right, guys, you're awesome. Take care.